Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin, and I'm glad you're with us. Fraud in an election. What is fraud? There's criminal fraud. There's civil fraud. What happens when a state abandons completely its constitution and the Supreme Court of that state conducts itself lawlessly? Is that fraud? I want to talk to you about a battleground state called the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It has one of the oldest legislatures in our country and one of the oldest constitutions in our country. We all know Philadelphia is the birthplace of the country. That's where the Declaration of Independence was written. That's where the Constitution was written. It's a very, very important battleground state. And the Democrats wanted to make sure that in 2020, it came out for Biden, because in 2016, it came out for Trump. What am I talking about? You hear this phrase, systemic fraud. There's no evidence of systemic fraud. You see reporters interviewing officials of various state governments saying there's no fraud whatsoever. Let me ask you a question. 14 months ago in the state of Pennsylvania, if you had voted by mail-in ballot, it would have been discarded. If that mail-in ballot had been counted, that would have been fraud. 14 months ago in the state of Pennsylvania, if you sent in a ballot without a signature, that ballot would be discarded. If it was counted, that would be criminal fraud. 14 months ago in the state of Pennsylvania, if you sent in a ballot with a signature that didn't match a signature that they had on file, that would be discarded. If it was counted, that would be criminal fraud. 14 months ago in the state of Pennsylvania, if you sent in a ballot beyond Election Day, it wouldn't be counted. And if it was, that would be fraud. If you sent in a ballot without a postal stamp date on it, it wouldn't be counted. And if it was, that would be fraud. Or if you sent in a ballot where they couldn't tell what the date was, because maybe there was a smudge on the ink, it wouldn't be counted. And if it was counted, that was fraud. All of those ballots today count. They were all counted in Pennsylvania because of unconstitutional and illegal changes that were made by officials and made, quote unquote, officially by individuals in Pennsylvania. None of this is discussed in a single newsroom in America, on a single TV show, radio show, or any other show. So I want to slowly walk you through what took place in Pennsylvania. And this sort of thing has taken place to some degree or another in numerous states. October 2019. 14 months ago, the Republican state legislature in Pennsylvania passed an omnibus bill called Act 77. In Act 77, they included language there changing their election laws to allow universal mail-in voting. The problem is, Pennsylvania, being an old state, having an old constitution, one of the original state legislatures, didn't allow that. There wasn't even early voting in Pennsylvania. And the only way you could have a mail-in vote was through the absentee ballot. And you had to go through a process there, a multi-step process, in order to get an absentee ballot. Well, you might say, well, what about COVID-19? In October 2019, there was no COVID-19, was there? There was no virus. This push for mail-in voting has been going on with the Democrats for at least a decade. One of the first places they imposed it was in California, among other things. And they've tried to do this in every state. So the Republican state legislature in Pennsylvania buckled. They passed it, as I say, as part of this omnibus bill, and the Democrat governor, who's a leftist, signed it almost immediately. And in fact, all these statewide offices in Pennsylvania, you have left-wing Democrats in those offices, and you have a Republican legislature. Okay, that's the mail-in voting. What else happened? Well, what else happened was the governor didn't think it went far enough. So he goes to the legislature and he says, you know, the signature requirements, we really shouldn't have that. The postmark requirements, we really don't need that. These other requirements that it has to be in by Election Day, there ought to be a few more days afterwards where we can count the ballots. The legislature said, no, we're not going to do that. He said, oh, yes, you are. So he winds up going to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. The Supreme Court of Pennsylvania has 7 justices. A couple of years ago, they had an election for 3 justices. The Republicans really weren't paying attention to it. The Democrats were. And they backed 3 hardcore leftists for the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. Among other things, they were thinking of 2020. The labor unions poured in a fortune. The teacher unions poured in a fortune. The usual groups poured in a fortune, and they won all 3 seats. And now the makeup of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, as they say the members are elected, is 5-2 Democrat. And the Democrats, when it comes to election law, those 5 stick together, much like the 3 Democrats and John Roberts on the U.S. Supreme Court. So what did those Democrats do? They said, you know what? We have a good idea. A few months before the election, they said, yes, no signatures required. You don't need signature comparisons. You don't need a postal date. And if the postal date is smudged, you're to count it anyway. Oh, and yes, even though Election Day ends on Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to extend it to 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday. They had no legal or constitutional basis for doing any of that. So they violated Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution, which leaves the power to the state legislature to make the election laws. Now let's circle back. Stay with me here. The reason why reporters don't cover this is either they're left-wing or they're too stupid to follow this. The moment the state legislature in October 2019 passed the change to its election laws to allow mail-in voting as the base, they violated the state constitution of Pennsylvania. Now, why is that? Under the Constitution of Pennsylvania, if there are to be any election law changes, you have to amend the Constitution. Did they amend the Constitution? No. What's required to amend the Constitution of Pennsylvania? It's very complicated. There needs to be a majority vote of both houses of the state legislature. Not once, but twice. Then there needs to be a respite. Then there needs to be ads in at least 2 papers in every county in Pennsylvania, all 67 counties. Then there needs to be a respite. And then, finally, the citizenry of Pennsylvania get to vote on whether or not they want the amendment. It has to be on the ballot. Did that happen? No, it didn't happen. The citizenry of Pennsylvania, we talk about disenfranchisement, they weren't asked to vote on this change in their election laws for mail-in ballots, let alone all these other changes that the state Supreme Court made. They weren't asked at all. They were utterly disenfranchised. So the state legislature in October 2019 acted unconstitutionally. The governor, by signing it, acted unconstitutionally. The state Supreme Court, by changing even the unconstitutional law, acted unconstitutionally, plus violated that Article 2 section of the Constitution of Pennsylvania. This matter has now been appealed to the United States Supreme Court. Why? You have some courageous individuals in Pennsylvania, including Congressman Mike Kelly, Sean Parnell, who ran for the House in Western Pennsylvania, and 6 other petitioners. And they said, wait a minute, this whole thing is a disaster. We're going to sue that this whole thing is unconstitutional. So they sue. It goes to the Commonwealth judge. She's an appellate judge. And she's very courageous. And she rules, yes, I'm going to put in place a temporary injunction. Pennsylvania governor, Secretary of State, both Democrats, stop certifying electors. We're going to have a hearing in my court on Friday, 2 days later, and I'm putting in a temporary injunction, which means, and she said, because the petitioners are likely to succeed and win on the merits. Wow. The Attorney General of Pennsylvania, who's also a left-wing Democrat, who was also on the ballot at the time, he said, no. We want to subvert the appellate court. We want to get around the appellate court, just as we got around the Constitution in the first place, and go to our 5 friends on the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. They'll take up our case. So rather than prepare for the hearing on Friday, the Attorney General runs to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. And what does that court do? Within 48 hours, over the weekend before this one, they rule, you know what? Latches, you're here too late. So we're going to throw your case out. We're going to throw it out with prejudice, meaning you can't bring it up again. And don't you dare knock on our door again. Done.